So in this particular video, we truly enter the progressive era at a national level because we see the first of two presidents that are often deemed as progressives. Now we begin with Theodore Roosevelt, and he kind of had a meteoric rise even though he came from a very privileged background. He's a sickly child who makes up for it in adulthood by engaging in numerous physical activities. Upon graduation from Harvard, he held a number of positions and engaged in a number of adventures, including attempting to set up a cattle ranch in North Dakota, serving as governor of New York, resigning his commission as Assistant Secretary of the Navy so he could fight in the Spanish-American War, and eventually becoming Vice President and President. His mother and wife both died on the same day, in the same house, 11 hours apart in the year 1884. And this informed his attitude moving forward. And it really exemplifies his attitude, or caused his attitude, of having a zest for life. Now contrast him with William Howard Taft. The lifelong goal of Taft was to sit on the Supreme Court, and he finally achieved this in 1921 when he served as Chief Justice for 9 years. He worked his way through the ranks of the Ohio court system and became U.S. Solicitor General at a young age, so he has this legal background. And while Solicitor General, his good nature and temperament placed him on the radar of national politicians. As Governor of the Philippines, he supervised the building of schools and hospitals, he improved the roads, and he actively sought to involve the Philippine people in their own affairs, which made him immensely popular. He refused a Supreme Court nomination multiple times, and again, this is his lifelong goal. He refused it multiple times, stating that his work wasn't done. But he eventually was recalled to serve as Roosevelt's Secretary of War, and he essentially ran the government when Roosevelt went on a hunting trip. He's a big man. This is the bathtub that was custom built for Taft, which could fit 4 full-grown working men. Now, the first thing that these two men are known for is what's called trust busting, and there's an R and a T because it involved Roosevelt and Taft. Roosevelt earned the nickname Trust Buster, even though Taft busted up nearly twice as many during his presidency. Roosevelt brought suit against Northern Securities, a holding company for several large railroads that was led by J.P. Morgan. And Roosevelt actually met with Morgan on this issue, and Morgan felt that since he had saved the railroads from annihilation and had bailed out the government in 1895, he deserved some gratitude. The trust was nevertheless broken up in 1904, and the basis for the suit was the potential threat it could cause consumers. Roosevelt is also the one who began the legal prosecution of Standard Oil, under the justification that Standard Oil was continuing to receive the unfair railroad rebates, even though they were illegal, and that they had that 90% monopoly on the petroleum industry. The court's ruling, delivered under Taft, so he officially supervised it, was quite stunning. Standard Oil was given 6 months to formally dissolve. Now this is a win against large trusts, but Rockefeller heard this news in the middle of a golf game, and he simply said, buy Standard Oil. Rockefeller got even richer based on his shares in the numerous companies that founded in the aftermath of the breakup. But nevertheless, going after trusts is a progressive ideology exemplified by both Roosevelt and Taft. When we look at the idea of land, Roosevelt's record as a conservationist went back to his time as governor of New York, when he convinced the state legislature to preserve tens of thousands of acres of land in the Catskills and Adirondack Mountains, and he advocated for conserving the natural resources. He also personally visited Yellowstone and was instrumental in eventually getting the Grand Canyon turned into a national park. He truly wanted to preserve the land for public use, and this was informed by his personal experiences as a big game hunter, which is why he set aside 148 million acres. Now, Taft gained an anti-conservation reputation because he fired the Secretary of Interior shortly after taking office, and this individual had been very close with Roosevelt. Taft personally believed that some of the policies by which land had been set aside were illegal, And he also later fired Chief Forester Gifford Pinchot, another close friend of Roosevelt, due to his questioning of Garfield's successor's policy of returning land set aside for public use to private development. This decision to fire the Chief Forester is what really prompted Roosevelt to begin thinking, hey, maybe I can run again. Maybe 1912 I'll run for president. So with conservation, both could take up that mantle. The Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act can be viewed as reactions to the jungle. Now, the Meat Inspection Act called upon strict inspection of all parts of the meatpacking process, and those that were found to be healthy would have a government label stamped on them. The Pure Food and Drug Act came about because the head chemist for the Department of Agriculture had been trying for over a decade to try and pass legislation that would require companies to properly label their food and drugs. The context for this was that for decades, or for generations actually, peddlers had been selling miracle cures, knowing full well that they would not work, and John D. Rockefeller's father actually made a career out of this. There was opposition to such outright government oversight, but momentum built up when several muckraking articles exposed immoral advertising practices, and the public pressure began to mount. The Pure Food and Drug Act was signed into law summer of 1906. So for public safety, Roosevelt really gets the credit for this. And with regard to business, and specifically railroads, Roosevelt explicitly targeted them. And this was the first step in his administration's antitrust legislation. A West Virginia congressman sponsored legislation that was designed to curb the practice of railroad rebates, which Rockefeller had famously used for decades as part of his business model. So this is before the breakup of Standard Oil. The Elkins Act was designed to toughen current laws and allow large corporations to be prosecuted for their participation in them, not just the railroad agents who granted the rebates. It passed in 1903. 3 years later, the Hepburn Bill provided the Interstate and Foreign Commerce Committee, so the federal government, the sole right to determine railroad rates. Each supposedly broke the monopoly on shipping and transportation that farmers claimed for years railroad executives wielded against them. So at the national progressive level, we're also seeing work done in terms of preserving natural resources, overall public safety, and going after the railroads. Finally, we have labor and revenue. When it came to the labor movement, which is a mainstay of progressive politics, Roosevelt's actions during the Colorado labor wars in the early 1900s really exemplified his mood. Continual strikes by the Western Federation of Miners had dragged on for over a year, and the governor of Colorado had declared martial law. When he requested that Roosevelt send in troops to restore order, Roosevelt declined and stated he'd only do so if events escalated to insurrection levels. Roosevelt believed in the existence of both organized labor and big business, but he really felt that corruption needed to be reined in. And the muckraker Ray Stannard Baker had even written an article assigning blame to both sides. Now, this willingness to acknowledge existence of both labor and business was typified a couple of years earlier when there was a coal strike, and Roosevelt invited the leader of the mines and the leader of the strikers to D.C. to settle the matter. Now, the major issue surrounding Taft's presidency was a new tariff. Now, the tariff was a huge issue. Something needed to be done because revenues from land sales were dwindling, given so much land had been set aside for the purpose of conservation. Direct taxation is the most logical step, but that had been ruled unconstitutional following the Civil War, and the 16th Amendment hadn't been ratified. To simplify this complex issue, Taft made a transcontinental tour in support of what was called the Payne-Aldrich Tariff, and it ignited fierce debate in its reduction of rates, although once it was passed, it was a non-issue. And this is Taft's major accomplishment. So these two men, Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, are really carrying progressive politics from the local and state level and making them nationwide mandates.